I think a lot of people in the past had taken for granted the role of news organizations like ours, and now they don't take us for granted anymore.
On the other hand, Marty's right. It's, I mean, the criticism is relentless. The praise, nicely, is more, but the criticism is also relentless. And we're one of the few businesses that sometimes makes their readers unhappy, makes their audience unhappy.
Investigative journalist and writer James O'Keefe is founder and president of Project Veritas.
So when people talk about the work you do, there's no question that if you look at the results, that you catch people saying things that they wouldn't say normally if they knew a journalist was in the room. If they knew they were talking to a journalist, they wouldn't behave in the way that they do. And I think people are open to that. They're willing to see that, you know, hypocrisy, duplicity, those things are, when you uncover those are part of bedrocks of journalism. But where you lose a lot of journalists are the methods that you go about doing it, where you send somebody in to pose as something they're not. Can you talk about why you do that? Talk about your methodology.
Well, first of all, I'm going to answer your question about that, but let me first tell you a bit about why I'm here. I'm not here to seek recognition from established media. I don't seek your praise, and I don't really care what the established media thinks of me. I'm here because I recognize the power that's inherent in mainstream media. Okay, our stories can't succeed unless they get in the mainstream media. That's our mission. And this week, we were on every single TV station in Missouri after we caught Claire McCaskill and her staffers. Every TV station. I understand that the media has more power than all three branches of government, because an informed citizenry is what makes that power. And a lot of people in the media don't think there's anything wrong with the media, but the media is not very popular amongst the American people. So what we did, and what journalists have a problem with, Andy, is we went undercover into the media itself. I mean, who's going to guard the guardsmen? Brian Stelter seems like a nice guy, but I don't think so. Someone has to hold them accountable. If the media has more power than all three branches of government, and many people in history have said that, who is going to hold them accountable? So we go undercover, because you had asked me about Dean Baquet, executive editor of the New York Times, and posing as a victim in the Washington Post. We go undercover into CNN. We find a CNN producer in Atlanta who says that the Russia story is for ratings. In his words, it was, and I quote, the Russia story was, and I quote, bullshit, unquote. His words, not mine. I don't report anything unless you can see and hear it coming out of people's own mouths. That's a standard that's well above and beyond Bob Woodward, who quotes anonymous sources relaying information from another anonymous sources months after the fact and uses poetic license by putting that in quotation marks.
But address the issue of methodology then. So, I mean, you've established, and I think, you know, I acknowledge that from the beginning, people, it's clear that, you know, your results, the things that people say, they've acknowledged that, yes, people say things differently when they're in private. But why do you send in people, reporters, the Washington Post case that you just referenced?
Well, we sent a reporter because
who posed as a victim.
Due to the extraordinary urgency of the circumstances and how broken we think the media has become. And this is not a right-wing sentiment. You can go ahead and read Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent to understand the perverse economic incentives that exist in the media, the pressure that advertisers put on people. This is not a right-wing methodology. You can go back and read Edward Bernays' Propaganda. You can read Walter Niebuhr talk about the stupidity of the average man. We went into the Washington Post for one reason, to draw people out. Look at the history of undercover journalism. You have people posing as longshoremen. You have the Chicago Sun-Times, which has denied a Pulitzer Prize for posing as a bartender for 9 months. You look at the history, people posed as drug traffickers. We posed as pimps, prostitutes, telephone technicians. It's always to draw an honest conversation out of the person we're talking to. And I unequivocally and categorically deny that I ever tried to plant a fake story, ever. If you go back and read the original Washington Post story, they did not report that. Those were motives that were falsely attributed to me after the fact. And I would go under oath, as would my entire staff, if given the opportunity. I would go under oath to say that.
You feel like you can't get into those conversations unless you go in with duplicitous, or you go in as under false pretenses?
You can't. People are not going to be honest oftentimes. It's like what veteran journalist Ken Aletta said, that politicians are going to make it really hard for you to know what they're actually thinking and doing. So this is his words, not mine. You need to bribe and seduce them. I mean, spare me that this is not about journalism ethics, okay? This is about power. This is about who you are allowed to investigate, because if we were doing this to the NRA or to anti-abortionists, y'all would be singing my praises.
James, can you talk about the perspective you bring to your stories. That's one of the criticisms another criticism that journalists have is that you come at these stories from a conservative perspective. Do you feel like those voices are being heard, or like Selena's saying that that's another problem?
I think that the criticism of an agenda is irrelevant. I mean, ultimately what matters is what the person is saying, and truth is paramount. And when it comes to the purity of journalism, and the closest thing to journalism is we use videotape. It's videotaped evidence. It's the irrefutability of what we do that people don't like. It doesn't leave room for interpretation. Images transfix in a way that words don't. You can hear the intonation, you can hear the cadence, there's no disagreement. And I think that is the irrefutability of what we do that upsets people. If you look at the history of journalism, Upton Sinclair, if you read his biography, he was an avowed socialist. More power to him. If you look at undercover people, there have been people who've done this, they stopped doing it in the last 25 years. If you look at people, there's a reporter named Günter Wohlruf, and he actually infiltrated a German newspaper by being a reporter. And he had an agenda. His agenda was workers' rights so that the workers could strike. I don't think motive and agenda and political philosophy is relevant. I don't think that should be part of the calculation. The only thing that matters is what it is that you are reporting and whether or not it's true. All this discussion about ethics is besides the point, because it really the discussion about the ethics is a subjective one. Because what matters is what constitutes a compelling public interest. And that's what this is really about. It's about what constitutes that interest.
Do you, just so we all know, do you have any journalists embedded in any newspapers across the country now?
Do we have people embedded in newspapers?
Yeah, any of your reporters?
Well, we're not going to acknowledge, we have a video coming out tomorrow on another United States senator. But if you have integrity, if there's no difference between how you project yourself to the world and what you say, you shouldn't be worried about people like me. If people had integrity, they shouldn't be paranoid.
Can you address the one issue, the veracity that you just talked about? Some people say, well, but he's selective in the way he cuts the videos, the way he shows the videos. Address that.
Selective editing. All journalism is edited selectively so. Newspaper people select their words and they arrange them in sentences to paint an elaborate portrait. But I mean, you talk about gutter standards. There's a quote in the Washington Post I read, quote, "There is no evidence that he did not say the things attributed to him," unquote, in the Wolf Book. How are you supposed to disprove a negative? In the last 2 weeks, I've seen NBC News apologize for editing Trump's comments. I've seen CNN retract multiple stories. The Washington Post, Carol Lenning, retracted 2 headlines about me. They said I went after Acorn because I was motivated by an animus of African Americans. She retracted that. You don't read Carol Lenning, who retracted a story about James O'Keefe. In other words, our honesty and our integrity, the ratio of, I've never had to retract a story. There's only 2 edits people are upset about. That's me not wearing a pimp costume when I said I wanted to start brothels.
That was the Acorn
Pimp
situation,
protocol
right?
does not require the wearing of pimp costumes to be a pimp. And then the second was with the NPR investigation with a scene change. We've done 100 undercover investigations, and those are the only 2 edits that people can attack me for.
James, when you do your pieces, do you feel like your opinion comes through?
No.
How much does it motivate that?
It doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't come through.
How about in choosing your targets, though? Because
we go after the sacred cows, the groups that the media refuses to investigate. I mean,
but only from a conservative perspective.
Well, you could say that a lot of media outlets are entirely monolithic in who they go after. And if that's their standard, then I guess we ought to be investigating more and more organizations. But my view can't come through. It's the purest form of journalism to capture someone in their own words. But to answer your question, that intent, my opinion, is completely irrelevant. What matters is what is being exposed. And if it's real, that's all that matters. More power to the people who have agendas, as long as they're reporting the facts.
Right.
And it's real, and that's why we call it Veritas, a cinema verite.
James O'Keefe at a First Amendment conference with Dean Baquet, Marty Barron. What has this meant for you to be here?
I think it's important for people to know the truth. I'm not making emotional arguments, I'm making rational arguments. And the quote that hangs on my office wall is that the famous quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends." There is a storied tradition of undercover journalism. This past week, Claire McCaskill called for a special prosecutor to come after me. Where is the media? You have to practice some introspection. You have to understand the ironies inherent in your calling for off with his head and inquisitions. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is what's on the tape. Stay tuned tomorrow because there's another United States Senator coming.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.